Now, you would think, especially if you're a moral philosopher, you would wonder, and if you're an economist, and we're into rational utilitarianism, you would ask yourself, well, why is this? This is insanity. We're broke as a state, we're almost broke as a county, we're broke as a city. Why is it that our spending ratios are so crazy? Why is it that we are putting mentally ill people in the most expensive place on the planet to deal with their mental illness? Why aren't we putting them in community-based resources where it's actually a lot less expensive and a lot more effective? And it turns out that the answer to that why question is extremely complex. There's a fundamental problem that has faced our society probably since the beginning of our nation, and has really faced societies for a long, long time, probably ever since civilization started. And that is, how do we deal with mentally ill people who are unwilling to accept any kind of voluntary treatment? So we're really talking about people who have some sort of addictive disorder, or they have addictive disorder, or they have a mental illness, and they're in complete denial of some kind. Or maybe they're in partial denial, but they say, well, I'm not sick and I don't need help. And yet they really are sick and they really do need help. How do we deal with them? And the response really is to either use social control through punishment, which is basically incarceration, or through some kind of therapeutic intervention. Now, the decision whether or not you want to use a social control through punishment or social control through therapeutic intervention really depends upon some basic moral assumptions you make about life. And there are really three basic moral assumptions, or three moral perspectives. This is how people approach the whole concept of morality. The first is that moral choice is a matter of will. And this is a choice that has been espoused by many moral philosophers over many, many centuries. It probably gained the greatest credence in the 19th century, in the Victorian era in England. And Freud was a huge proponent of this with his hydraulic theory of psychology and the workings of the mind. And it turns out, of course, that he was dead wrong. And we know that will has nothing to do with moral choice. It's not to say that will has nothing to do with figuring out what is moral or not. That's a different issue. But if people are faced with moral choices, we cannot exhort them to make a decision, and we cannot expect will, whatever will is, to act in a way that will cause people to act in moral ways. However, this idea still predominates in our political circles and in our, especially here in Fresno, of all places, and in many of our faith communities. It's all about will. If you are an evil, immoral person, and you're making a free will and choice about being mentally ill or about engaging in addictive disorder. And that is a basic assumption about human behavior that the vast majority of our population believes in, and it turns out to be dead wrong. A second idea is that moral choice is a rational choice. And here are the theories. This is more of a mid-20th century idea. And the concept here is that if we raise your consciousness and tell you that there are bad consequences that will flow from your choice, as a rational, utility-seeking being, you will naturally and inevitably change your behavior. So if I tell you not to smoke, and I tell you that smoking will kill you, you will all naturally stop smoking. If I tell you that as a heroin addict, you should stop injecting heroin because it's bad for you and eventually will kill you, you will naturally, of course, recognize that problem and stop using heroin. If I tell you to abstain from sex before marriage, you will naturally abstain from sex before marriage because it's not right. Rational choice. Well, we know from experience that rational choice is not how people operate either. And we know now from neuroscience that we are 98% emotional and 2% rational. Every decision that a human being makes is cloaked in deep emotionality. We have a very, very limited bandwidth for making rational choice, even when we know the consequences of those choices. And I can tell you that as a peacemaker, I deal with this problem every day, because people rarely make rational choices when they get into conflict. It's almost always imbued in deep emotionality. And when we're talking about mental illness or addictive disorder, we're talking about people who, if there was such a thing as rationality to begin with, have altered states of consciousness due to dysfunctions in the brain that take away any kind of rationality that those of us who might otherwise have said would be rational at all. And so this problem persists. And that leaves us with sort of the current thinking about this for people who understand this stuff, and that is that moral choice is driven by perspective. Perspective is a vague word that I use to describe a whole bunch of different factors. But basically, people make moral choices based upon their life experience, a little bit based on their genetic makeup, based on their current living conditions, and based on the context in the moment. And the moral choice is almost always emotionally driven. So this whole idea that mental illness or addictive disorder leads to behaviors that people can rationally self-correct if they just exert will, or they can rationally self-correct because they can understand the consequences of the behaviors, is false. People make moral choices, and what we would consider to be bad moral choices, because they are driven to do so from the context of their environment, their lifestyle, their genetics, and their life experience, their developmental experience. And that is something that the law has a difficult time dealing with. It's also difficult for the faith community to understand that, and it's impossible for the politicians to grasp that. It's impossible for them to grasp that, which is one of the reasons why we have the problems we have today. So that's the first problem. So that gets us to addiction, and whether or not addiction is a choice or a disease. And I got my compadre over here who's an expert on that.
I wouldn't say an expert, but I am from Minnesota, and that is a state that thinks it's a health issue, that thinks if you're not in recovery, you're in denial, and there are 10,000 treatment centers. So when I moved to California, after practicing law back there, working in the addictions field, and being a public lobbyist, here, I was just amazed at the level of denial in Fresno regarding addiction, regarding mental illness, lack of understanding. I had worked for 3 years for a firm in Minneapolis that traveled around the United States working on community mobilization to deal with addictions and abuse issues. And I've discovered that, for instance, in Alabama and Tennessee, it's clearly a moral issue. And so we'd be coming down from the Twin Cities thinking it was a health issue, we should have a public health response, and we found out not there. So for me, I think it's really important that people understand that people have a very different perspective about addiction, trauma, and mental illness. And they're all interrelated issues and very complicated. So you might ask yourself what you think it is, if it's a choice or if it's a disease. And what does that mean to you? Because I think every one of us has an opinion about that. In terms of the chemicals, I mean, if you look at our history in the United States, things have been legal or illegal for lots of different reasons over our history. Prohibition against alcohol was driven at one point, and all it did was make everything worse. If you look at these statistics, this is based on a 100-point chart, and alcohol tops the list in everything I've ever read about the harm to society and to human beings. It's alcohol, but that, of course, is legal. And then you walk down to the other various drugs. And then you ask yourself, well, why are some things legal and why are things not legal? Well, having been a lobbyist for Common Cause for 10 years, it was pretty clear to me that whatever single interest could dominate Congress and the legislatures pretty much determined what was legal and what was illegal. And so, once again, we're dealing with complexity and challenges in terms of solving it.
So one of the things that was probably most shocking to me going to law school was to learn that the law is subjective. We're both lawyers, and what you learn in law school, and then what I ended up teaching in law school, because I'm a professor over at San Joaquin College of Law, is that the law is anything that the legislature says it is. And that the laws that we have today, for the most part, are historical anomalies that have arisen over hundreds of years, and in some cases thousands of years, of human experience. But that there is no magical formula to what makes a law. It's whatever a society says the law is. And so we have to understand that law is subjective. And you can see this when we're dealing with mental illness, behaviors around mental illness, and addictive disorder. For example, I think you're all aware of the fact that the federal penalties, punishment, for being convicted of possession of crack cocaine is 15 to 25 times greater than the penalties for being in possession of powdered cocaine. Same exact chemical substance in a different form. And what's the difference? Rich white people use white powdered cocaine, and poor black men use crack cocaine. That is the only difference. And so the law is completely and totally subjective about what is legal, what is illegal, and what the punishments are for various crimes. It's totally at the whim of the political people. Now here's where it gets really interesting. If you study ethics and philosophy and you study justice, the concepts of justice as a part of moral philosophy, you will learn about the positive theory of justice, the positive law theory of justice. There are three classical theories of justice. There are many definitions to justice, and I could spend hours talking about this. But for our purposes, the three classical theories of justice are positive law, utilitarianism, and natural rights theories of justice. Positive law theory is the theory that most people adhere to. And basically what positive law theory of justice says is that justice equals obedience to law, and therefore justice equals punishment. What's really interesting about positive law that most people do not realize is that the positive law theory of justice has nothing to say about whether a law is fair, as we determine fairness, or whether it's applied equally across the board, or whether or not it is disproportionate in terms of how it affects people. Positive law theory has nothing to say about whether a law is good or bad. Positive law would never say this law is good or this law is bad. Positive law simply says, okay, the law is there. All we're going to do is determine whether or not the law was obeyed or not. And here's where we get into our problem. When you start classifying people who are mentally ill and engaging in behaviors that pass the bright line test of whether or not a law has been violated, whether or not there is obedience to law, as a judge, a jury, a district attorney, a public defender, a probation officer, or even a member of the Board of Supervisors or a member of the legislature, you don't have to worry about whether or not that's a good result anymore. You can completely disassociate yourself from the moral implications of that law by simply following the positive law theory of justice, and you are perfectly legitimate in saying we are just people. We are just people because we are providing a process for determining whether or not there has been obedience to law, and when there has been disobedience, of course, to maintain public security, safety, and to maintain the order of the state, we must punish, because that is mandated by positive law theory. And so part of the problem of the criminalization of mental illness is that people can find an excuse in moral philosophy that justifies conduct that, if we step aside and take a larger view of it, is absolutely abhorrent. And that's one of the problems and a layer of complexity that we have in this. And so when you hear the people who are tough on crime, people who insist on tougher sentences, people who insist on building more prisons, these are positive law theorists who are using positive law theory of justice as a means of engaging in a very soothing process, emotionally soothing process, not a rational process, an emotionally soothing process of dealing with the problem of behaviors that lead to disruption of communities and neighborhoods. And so that's one of the complexities that we have to deal with. So so far we've talked a little bit about the moral assumptions that underlie the criminalization of mental illness and addiction. We also have looked at a little bit of the moral philosophy and the problems that creates for us. Now let's see how it rolls out in terms of recent history. So in the 1960s, there was a shutdown of state hospitals due to federal funding shifts. And this began to occur in the late 1960s and it was one of those interesting times in California when both the Republicans and the Democrats were united, because there were abuses in the mental institutions that were around, and so everybody decided, well, we need to get rid of these horrible places, and so let's shut them down. And of course, the promise was that, well, we'll shut them down, we won't fund these things anymore with federal dollars, but we'll reallocate the money to community-based programs. And of course, what happened was that there was no money allocated to community-based programs. The money was diverted to military and to other places, but it did not come back. The money that was being spent on funding mental institutions did not come back to the communities for other types of processes. The second thing that happened in the 1970s was that the civil rights movement led to strict constitutional limitations on involuntary commitments, which in some ways was a corrective, because up until the passage of the Lamberton-Kiefer Short Act, which is Welfare and Institutions Code Section 5150 at SEC in the California statutes. For those of you writing that down, I'll repeat again. The Landerman-Petras Short Act, three names. There were three members of the California legislature that authored the bill. And the code section citation is Welfare and Institutions Code Section 5150 at SEC. So I'll just explain this subjective law to you very quickly. Up until LPS was enacted in 1969, if somebody were to be involuntarily committed, it was based on the very precise legal standard that this person needed treatment. Needs treatment was the language of the statute. And due to the education of the public that occurred during the civil rights movement, all of a sudden civil rights became important, and that included the civil rights of people who were mentally ill and suffered from addictive disorder. And so the Supreme Court, through a number of decisions, ruled that vague statutes that did not provide for constitutional protections were unconstitutional as violating due process and equal protection. And so the states were required to pass new laws, and of course California got out there in front of everybody else and passed the very first law that required a judicial hearing in order to commit somebody. And the standards were quite strict. The person either had to be gravely disabled, or there had to be a demonstration by clear and convincing evidence, which is higher than a preponderance of the evidence, a low burden of proof, but it's a fairly high standard of proof, that the person was in grave danger of harming other people. And even then, so the police could come in, somebody could commit somebody for 72 hours, put them on a 72-hour watch, and they had to have a hearing within 72 hours. If they didn't, they were released automatically. If they had the hearing, a judge had to make a ruling as to whether or not this person was gravely disabled or in imminent danger of harming somebody else. And so as a result of that, all kinds of people were now being released out of mental institutions and could no longer be committed against their will, even though they might have needed treatment. And remember that now we've completely defunded mental institutions. So where are these people going to go? It turns out they go out on the streets. And we started seeing a surprising and huge increase in the homeless populations in the United States in the 1970s as a result of these rulings. It was the unintended consequence of doing this stuff. 1980s, I remember them fondly. Ronald Reagan, many of you in here were not even born in those days, but Ronald Reagan was president, and he went about completely defunding social welfare programs at the federal government, at the federal level. And he also had his administration, besides, well, I won't say that, it's true, but I won't say it. He instituted the mass incarceration philosophy of criminology. And by that, there's a philosophy of criminology that has to do with mass incarceration. The idea, going back to rational utilitarianism, that if we make drug abuse or selling drugs really, really heavy in terms of penalties, people will stop doing it. And of course, that started the war on drugs, and look where we are today. Then what happened was, we got to the 1990s, and here in lovely Fresno, California, I was telling Andy before we started that Fresno County has an interesting paradox. It is the birthplace of the international restorative justice movement, and it is also the birthplace of three strikes. Think about that. What an amazing paradox. Most people don't know that. And the very first victim offender reconciliation program ever existed in the world started here in Fresno in 1981 with Ronald Reagan down in Fresno Pacific. And not too long after that, Mike Reynolds, with the help of the California Correctional Peace Officers Association, got 3 strikes passed by initiative, and we became the first state to start mass incarcerating people for